Why can't we change?
Well, yeah, I mean, this seems like a persistent.
I mean, all the things you said, all I want to say is yes. I mean, all of those things, racism, you know, the structural inequalities, you know, just our history of discrimination. We haven't figured out how to shift into a different kind of society. And I think somebody talked about the factory model of education. You know, that arose out of a time when we needed people to be educated and we needed to teach them fast. And so during the Industrial Revolution, I mean, this is a good thing. We started being able to send almost all children to school. And we expected them to come in a certain way, kind of all the same, pour the information in, and then they come out the same way. Well, it was a very homogenous society then, and we haven't figured out how to readjust our factory, or maybe we don't need a factory at all in education, that we need to be thinking about children as individuals, as coming with, you know, a set of experiences and a culture, and treating them like widgets isn't really going to be the answer. But I mean, how do we move out of that way of thinking? I think we need to look at education, but also beyond education. I mean, at the consequences of not doing it as a way to build political will. That, you know, the incarceration rates we've talked about, the unemployment disparities. I mean, Minnesota is in a terrible position. It's an embarrassment, really, that we have some of the largest achievement gap in the country. We have some of the largest health disparities in the country. I just saw today that the life expectancy for American Indians in our state is 61 years old, compared to 80, I think 84, 83, 84 for whites. I mean, that is a huge difference. We're doing something wrong there. You know, in our unemployment rate, we have the highest unemployment rate for African Americans in the country. I mean, in Minnesota, the highest disparity. So, you know, in a state where we used to brag about being the best at every, I mean, still, you read in the newspapers or magazines all the time, we're the healthiest state, the most educated state, but we aren't. We're failing a significant part of the population. And telling that story and telling how pervasive it is, you know, across opportunity areas is, I think, a really big part of building that political will, because I don't know that people, I kind of like data, but I don't know that people respond to data completely, that they also need the stories that go with the data, and they need to make that child who isn't their child, their child. It was Jeffrey Canada who talked about that, and one of the things that he said was that if you love this country, you have to love these children, all of these children. Otherwise, you're not following through with that.
This is my 7th year at Headwaters, and one of the things that I feel really good about is every day I go to bed feeling more hopeful than the last day, because of people like you and the organizations that I get to spend time with, that these long-term problems that appear intractable are actually being resolved, and solutions are coming forward right here around us every day. So I'd like just to invite that in the room as well.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what MMEP is doing, besides me getting calls from the Minneapolis Public Schools. We're actually doing a very interesting project in outstate Minnesota. We're working with 2 regional collaborative teams on equity and excellence. And we actually took RFPs from districts, community leaders to be a partner with MMEP to go through this process of what we're calling, there's a great sociologist named Dr. Sonia Nieto, and she says what we have to ask ourselves in a multicultural society are profoundly multicultural questions. And so when you look at school data, and a lot of people are doing this in different ways around the country. Ed Trust, you know, OPE is doing part of this work where you do data analysis and you look at disparities and then you unpack where does that come from. You know, who are the children getting access to AP courses? What does your teacher workforce look like? Do you have male teachers of color in your system? And so we're going to walk them through this analysis, and then we're actually going to develop what I just named equity action plans. And that plan will include how community will be involved, how the district will be involved, and local business leaders, foundation leaders, and is out. And we're training 2 policy fellows to help in building those equity plans. And it's a 9-month process, so we should have something developed, and we'll have summits in May and June to announce the plans of those communities. It's actually funded by the Bremer Foundation, so we told Bremer what we thought was happening in these areas. And we actually had community leaders that wanted to work with us on these projects. We also have a collaborative right now around African American males in education. Some folks from ALF are aware of our work, and so we want to combine efforts so that we could propose policy agendas around not just black males in Minneapolis public schools, but statewide. And we also have initiatives around college access. So we're doing, actually, tomorrow night, there's a Latino college fair at El Colegio. So we continue to partner with cultural communities to give information around college in the way that the community is asking for it. There's different questions based on first generation, language, understanding of college. And so I think beyond that, I mean, to be a partner with MMEP, you can join MMEP, certainly. You can be a member. But also I think we have to start really asking critical questions, because I think that, to be very blunt, the right is going to say it's just one thing. We're going to close the achievement gap by making sure all those kids read by 3rd grade. And then everyone can go home. No. The system has, again, we have to ask multicultural questions along the entire system. So I think as you're voting on candidates, ask them, you know, what is it about a diverse teacher workforce? Why aren't we getting there? It's not just about that reading by 3rd grade. You know, we need more black male teachers. We need Latino teachers. What about underfunding of education? And other groups like Parents United have the figures, but we have disinvested in public education. It's okay in this state to have a 4-day school week. You know, when that starts happening, you're actually dismantling democracy, is what you're doing. I have cousins in Mexico, and I'll tell you what a 3-day school week looks like. You're an adult and you can't read. So, you know, once you start dismantling the financial system of a public education system and democracy, you're headed down a very slippery slope. So again, what's going to happen in this movement in the next few years is it's just one answer, one solution. I think this crowd can start asking, what about community partnerships to build equity in Duluth or wherever this is happening? What about teachers of color? And what about the underfunding of education? They're all critical questions about the entire continuum.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing a number of things at OAP. My work around research and policy, I try to make it, my goal is to make it the kind of research and policy work that organizers are using in their communities and that citizens are using in their communities, but also that leaders, that policymakers are using. And so trying to place that racial equity lens on everything that I do. So the legislative report card on racial equity will come out in January at the beginning of the session. Along with that, we'll be releasing a racial equity agenda, which looks to the future. The report card looks back at the last session. The agenda is going to look forward and recommend where we need to go, what we need to move. And that's a tool for everybody to use in holding our legislators accountable, in going to them and asking that we move certain ideas. So that's an important part of what we do. The other thing that I think is so important is to continue to build leadership, to train organizers, to give them the tools and the skills and the connections in the community that are important for them to make real change. So that's a huge part of what we do. And then the education equity work that we're doing is really trying to reach out across the state of Minnesota and reach different levels of decision making in education, from individual schools and teachers and classrooms all the way up to the state level, and working with districts and with charter schools as well as district schools, and trying to build equity into how they're addressing issues across the board, from things like detention and suspension rates to how they implement tests to the number of teachers of color in the school. Minnesota's population, or the number of teachers of color, it's only 3.5% across the state, which is low. I think it's 1 in 3 children under the age of 18 are students of color in Minnesota. So, a third of our population with 3.5% teachers of color. I'm making the point that we have only 3.5% of our teachers are teachers of color versus a third of our students as students of color. So we need to change that. Another issue, a number of issues are coming up or have come up. Integration revenue funding, that has been, there's a sunset, the program is ending, and there's just been a task force appointed that's supposed to make some decisions about how that money is going to be repurposed very, very quickly. They're supposedly going to make this decision by, I think, February.
So could you, sometimes we get into some things that are either highly technical
Uh-huh.
or things I don't understand. So what is that?
We've had this funding stream. It's integration revenue funding that the state has distributed to districts that have high numbers of students of color, with the purpose of encouraging integration, racial integration across schools. And the idea is that, you know, schools that have high, or districts that have high numbers of students of color have greater needs. They need more resources. There have been problems with the integration funding program. I mean, things like not being real clear in defining what the money's for, so it hasn't always actually gone towards integration work. But sometimes it's gone towards building real equity in a district. Other times it's done things like have a one-time sort of cultural diversity fair. So whether that's real integration work or not is up for debate. You know, it depends. But what's at stake is a large pot of money that many districts have come to rely upon, and that is going to be cut and repurposed in a way that we don't know yet. So that's a way. I mean, that task force was just announced last week. It includes the likes of Catherine Kirsten on the right, Carlos Mariani at MMEP. It includes people like Myron Orfield at the Institute on Race and Poverty, and talking to those people, letting it be known how you feel about that money and the impact that funding has on students of color is an important step. You know, even it's beyond that kind of legislative action, and of course voting and paying attention to all that is important, but these policy changes are happening at so many different levels, and it's hard to pay attention, but that's one where we could have an impact in a very short time period.